Welcome back to our Future of U.S.-China Conference. As a reminder, our program is in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions for any of our speakers, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll be monitoring those all day. And if any speakers in the audience want to answer some of those questions, because we do have a lot of them coming in, please feel free to do so. We do want to make this as interactive as possible. We are recording and all of these videos will be made available after our conference. Now, for session 3, technology. How is the growing divide and technology conflict between the U.S. and China impacted industries in fundamental ways? Joining us, Howard Chao from Doon Capital, Wenting Yu from O'Melveny and Myers. Both of those are sponsors. Thank you very much. Michael Dunne, our board member, Andrew Chung, and moderating this session is Denise Zheng. Denise.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon to all of our audience members in the Western time zones of the country, and or rather good morning to you all and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. My name is Denise Zheng. I'm head of the Technology and Innovation Policy Program at Business Roundtable, which is an organization that represents CEOs of Fortune 500 companies based in Washington, D.C. I think we're planning a very timely and interesting discussion about technology and in particular the competition and potential cooperation between the US and China on technology issues. But before we dive into the substance, let me just quickly introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. First is Howard Chao of Doon Capital. Howard is an investor and counselor to entrepreneurs focusing on early stage tech companies primarily located in the US and China. Andrew Chung of 1955 Capital, where he is the founder and managing partner. Andrew's work is very focused on investing in companies to help solve the most pressing issues in the developing world. And Michael Dunne, entrepreneur and author with special expertise in China and mobility issues in the auto industry. Michael is CEO of ZoZo Go, which is an investment advisory firm based in Hong Kong, also focusing on China and mobility. And Wenting Yu of the law firm O'Melveny and Myers, where she focuses on securities offerings, venture financing, M&As, and works with startups and larger companies really across a variety of different sectors. So we're very, very pleased to have our speakers here. And I am looking forward to diving into the substance. So over the past 2 decades, the US and China and their economic growth has really become closely linked, right? Part of this is because of the technological trajectories of both countries and that have become really combined. I would characterize this relationship to exhibit, extraordinary levels of interdependence, right? But also competition, especially over technology. However, over the last several years, we're hearing a lot from both companies about a desire to separate these two ecosystems, to decouple our supply chains because of increasing mutual suspicion, mostly regarding national security issues, but also with regard to human rights as well. And if you talk to policymakers in Washington, I'd say the mindset is very much that China and the US are in this sort of zero-sum competition for dominance, especially in technology. So what I'd like to do is turn to our panelists for their insights. I want to begin with Howard with this question, but I also want to give each of our experts to give a chance for them to share some insights on this question as well, which is, what are some of the macro level trends that we're seeing in this US-China relationship as it relates to technology? How has the US-China tech relationship changed over the past 10 years? What are the key conflicts? And are there areas for cooperation? So Howard, over to you.
Hi, Denise. Thanks for the question. So I just returned this Monday from China to California, China being the largest COVID bubble in the world. I was there for the last 3 months on mostly business. And I got to say that these kinds of questions have been heavy on my mind in China. I did a lot of business meetings and a lot of dinners and other events there, unlike what's possible here. And one of the conclusions that I reached, although I suspected as much before I got to China, was that predictions of the decoupling and demise of engagement between the U.S. and China are exaggerated and premature. I think there is certainly some confusion between what policymakers want to happen, on both sides of the Pacific. I think there's a desire to decouple both in Washington and in Beijing, and a difference between that and what's going to happen because of economic realities. So I think that's something we really need to keep an eye on and maybe discuss. A second point to be along those lines, the Asia Society did a terrific symposium a couple of months ago on the sector which is perhaps the most controversial and difficult and sensitive of all technology areas between the U.S. and China, which is semiconductors. And even in that area, it was pretty clear in that discussion that policymakers in the U.S. are very conflicted about how far to take this decoupling. Clearly they can't decouple with China on all semiconductor transactions. They are very mindful of the dependence of the U.S. industry on China sales. And of course, one of the points they made was that revenues from China fund U.S. R&D, which help the U.S. lead the semiconductor industry. So how are you going to maintain that lead if you cut off 40% of your revenues? So that's on semiconductors. Now, today, I hope that we'll be able to talk about some other industries and sectors because it's much more complicated in other ones. Michael is here today. He's an expert in the automotive industry, where I think it's even a much more difficult and I can't see decoupling happening much at all in the automotive sector unless something really drastic happens. So that's one sort of general subject area that I think would be worthwhile to discuss today. A second thing that I note in response to some of the discussion earlier this morning, I have a lot of friends in China in the VC and PE industries that run fairly significant funds. And one of the things that struck me is that it is increasingly the case that their major investors, their major LPs, are arms of the Chinese government, SOE funds. They're passive investors mostly in those funds. So the funds are being run largely independently, but the government is the large shareholder in many of those funds. So I think it's a very different model for a central state-owned economy than what we've seen in China in the past, but it's part of this dual circulation economy that I think we heard about earlier this morning, and how it's going to be defined in the future. But China is a continental-sized economy where they feel that they can be largely self-sufficient because of the size of their economy. It's one of the few economies of that size in the world, the other being the U.S. And so I think there's a trend, as we all know, for self-reliance in China. So that's something I think we should talk about some more today as well.
Thank you for that, Howard. And next, I want to go to Andrew Chung to talk a little bit more about this. I mean, do you agree with Howard's assessment? I think some of the points come at, there's a tension there, right? There's a desire for self-sufficiency, to reduce dependencies. Both sides have that desire. It's a strong desire. So how do you square that with the fact that it's going to continue to be very challenging to decouple these supply chains? Both sides seem to want to pursue that in the longer term. So Andrew, over to you. What do you think are the key conflicts, areas of cooperation? What are the motives driving this?
Thanks, Denise. And to Margaret and the Asia Society team, let me just echo the sentiment that it's an honor to be a part of this event with you, Secretary Schultz, Secretary Kissinger, Prime Minister Rudd, and others. Denise, I think you're right that a lot has changed over the last 10 years regarding some of these questions that we're tackling this morning. There was an enhanced wave of collaboration after President Xi took office in 2012, when China was inviting a lot of the technology partnerships. The Made in 2025 ZoZo our initiative from his first 5-year plan really encouraged that. And then a significant shift happened a few years later with the government shutting down a lot of the capital outflows. I think a lot of partners reneged on their obligations over in China. And there were some technology collaborations that really did fall apart. There were some large players that stayed in, given that China was such a key piece of the supply chain, and decoupling turned out to be very difficult. And then, of course, China is a key end market for a lot of these companies. Relationships became very strained. I think with the recent US presidential administration creating a lot more of the friction to cross-border partnerships, there were some direct attacks on the supply chains, roadblocks that were created to foreign investment. I think that's really worsened the situation. And China, as we've discussed earlier today, in turn, has focused a lot on becoming a lot more self-reliant from a technology development and production standpoint. So I think some of the other issues that haven't changed over the last 10 years, as much as we would have liked them to have, is that intellectual property protection remains a concern. There's a movement to advance that, but that's slowed. Language and cultural barriers remain an issue. And as many folks have talked about today, trust is a critical problem. So where does that leave us? I think I would agree with Howard that the opportunity and criticality for this type of collaboration has never been greater. And most of the folks that are in the ecosystem are trying to find ways to think through ways to partner in a safe and reliable way. In my area, which is in venture capital, tackling a lot of the issues that humanity is grappling with. So at 1955 Capital, we invest in areas like energy and environment, food, agriculture, health, and education. Thinking about the issues in China really illuminate why global partnership is important. Hundreds of millions of people in China don't have access to clean drinking water. They have the highest incidence and growth rates in heart disease, cancer, diabetes. 300 million pigs died from the African swine flu. It devastated the country's protein supply. And more than 1 million people die annually from air pollution-related disorders prematurely. This is something that's rarely talked about, even though the numbers far, far exceed those from the COVID pandemic. So China has a survival-driven demand for a lot of these technologies, like those related to climate change and healthcare, that can address these issues. And the US happens to have a lot of cutting-edge technology and research in these areas. So how do you put that together? Because until very recently, investor interest, corporate imperative, government support hasn't historically been the most urgent in the United States around these areas in which I invest. That has historically made it more difficult in the US to fund a lot of these types of moonshot solutions that are beneficial to the world. I'm reminded of the last time that we had a US-China presidential trade mission, and I was honored to be asked to participate in that during the Obama administration. When our side addressed Chinese leaders about a range of issues from human rights to cybersecurity, these issues were often met with a cold response. When the topic shifted to environmental technologies, the body language in the room notably changed. The Chinese leaned forward, they started to take notes, they adjusted their translating devices because they realized that cooperation was really important in this area, among others. So in my mind, I think the motivation for finding a path to work together has never been more vital. I think technologists and investors can't operate in silos. They have to let moonshot solutions or other technology solutions serve as an olive branch to unify nations like the US and China against common obstacles. So I think this topic is very important. And I retain a bit of an optimism despite all of the difficulties and challenges, because I think this is really critical for humanity in the next century going forward.
Thank you for that, Andrew. And I think I want to come back to you to talk more about what is happening in health and environment and areas for future cooperation in those areas. But next, I want to turn to Michael and ask if you share the enthusiasm we're hearing from some of our other panelists, or the optimism.
Yes, thank you, Denise, and thank you, Asia Society, for the opportunity to join this distinguished panel. Just listening to my co-panelists' comments, you got a lot of smarts, deep experience, and a pragmatic approach to China. Big value there. Now, I think when you step back and think about it, taking the pulse of our clients, our tech clients globally, in Europe, United States, Japan, Korea. It really feels like we're on the front end of a monumental shift in the ways in which they look at China. What do I mean by that? Specifically, whereas in the past there was a feeling, there was a sort of confidence and optimism that if they put in the hard yards to secure that license, did their homework and got close to the customer, ultimately in China, they would be able to secure a kind of permanent resident status. Not citizens, but permanent residents, fixtures in the economy. Today, however, more and more of our clients are feeling as if, hey, we need to rethink things in China. Perhaps permanent resident status will never become a reality. In contrast, we're feeling like maybe we'll be lucky to get a tourist visa that's renewable annually and subject to the whims of this or that granting agency. All right. So to put some context or give you some illustration of what I'm talking about, allow me to go back in time and compare an event 20 years ago with today and how that's changed. And I'm reminded that all of us panelists were told that everything here is on the record, which is code for say things as close to what other people are thinking without tripping any wires. So let's have a go at that. Take you back, 1995, I found myself standing in an expansive piece of land in Zhanjiang City, across from Hainandao, the western reaches of Guangdong province, empty in a future industrial park. And I was there with executives from Chrysler and from their would-be Chinese partner. And the deal was that Chrysler was bidding against Mercedes-Benz for the rights to secure a license to manufacture a minivan called the National Minivan Project. Whoever got that project would build minivans for the entire country. It'd be a monopoly. So naturally, the two partners had different views. That Chrysler excited about the prospect of potential market. And on the Chinese side, well, what were they interested in mostly? And I had the opportunity that day, a chief engineer from the Chinese partner side was there. And I said, what are your expectations for this joint venture to be formed? And he didn't hesitate. He said, engine. We want a Chrysler engine. And I thought, oh, he knows exactly what he wants. Which Chrysler engine? What do you have in mind? He goes, no, just as long as it's the newest technology, the newest engine, 最新的发动机就好了. Okay, so it was so apparent to me that he had one thing on his mind, and we all know this as China hands. The Chinese have this hunger to secure the best technology. The foreigners are looking for the market. Yeah. So that sort of, for the next 20 years, that played out in a way that, well, they got some and we got some, and everyone is more or less getting enough to stay engaged in the game. And it kind of reminds me of the song by Bob Seger, Night Moves, where he goes, I used her, she used me, neither one cared, we're getting our share. Okay, that kind of worked out. It was messy, but it was real, and everyone got some benefit from it. Now, fast forward to today, and the picture's completely changed. China today, massive market. There's no doubts about the market. It's already there. Car industry, biggest in the world. Technology, much of it has already moved into China. So tech companies start to look and say, where is this leading? Where is our participation in this market leading? Will it still be sort of balanced, or are we moving in a new direction? And what scares them is the example of Samsung. Once a powerhouse, hands down leader in handsets and smartphones in China, in TVs, etc. Guess what? A year ago, Samsung closed its last factory in China. It's over, game over. So if that could happen to Samsung, could it also happen to other tech companies? Why not? And as a result of this, what we've seen among our clients in the last 24 months especially is a question. Hey, China is a sensational market with tremendous opportunity, but let's pull back the lens and look at other areas of Asia. How do we put these pieces of puzzle together so that we can bank on being permanent residences in those markets in the future, whereas China might be let's be realistic, a short-term play where they can collect cash to fund their R&D, or just do business for as long as possible. That's the sentiment currently. It isn't as optimistic as we'd like it to be, but I think it's realistic and it's based on experience.
Thank you for that, Michael. Really appreciate that example. It really makes it sort of feel more real life. And next, I want to turn to Wenting. I know you've worked a lot on investment restrictions, and you've seen that very close up. Could you tell us a little bit about sort of the trends that you're seeing in that space between the U.S. and China?
Sure. Thank you, Denise, for the question. And thank you, Asia Society, for involving me. It's a great honor to be here. It's fascinating to hear all the stories our panelists have shared. We've advised clients in all kind of cross-border transactions. And as our panelists have shared, the general trend, I think we're still far from decoupling. And from where the trade war started, it's essentially a technology war. I mean, the U.S. has implemented a lot of policies and regulations trying to stop or slow the pace for China to acquire new technologies. So there's this FIRMA 2018 regulation that broadens the scope of CFIUS review to add the minority foreign investment into their scope. And there's also the Export Control Reform Act in 2018 that was passed at around the same time to authorize the U.S. Commerce Department to establish controls on export of emerging and foundational technology. The proposed rules, what that entails, is still close to be finalized. But with that, the trend we're seeing in the private investment world is the capital inflow from China to the U.S. has significantly dropped since 2018. I think we saw the data, so the 2019 and 2020 were hitting the record low of investment from China to the U.S. At the same time, the U.S. capital outflow to China from U.S. to China is still increasing every year. So there's a big market there in China. There's great customer demand there. And a lot of the economies are intertwined between the two countries. So it's hard, it's complicated to decouple. And the smart money found their ways into the market where the capital is needed, where the customer demands are.
So Wenting, maybe staying with you here, because I do see a question in our Q&A chat box just about what is the current policy in China for foreign direct investment into the U.S. and what does the future hold in these regards? Could you talk a little bit about could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think in December, just a couple of weeks ago, China released a new rule which will take effect on the coming Monday, in January 18th. So this is a new measure on foreign investment. So that kind of was more in reaction to what has adopted in U.S. and other countries in terms of more enhanced foreign investment control. So China has been taking a more active approach in invoking sort of national security oversight of their foreign investment. And the law, which just came out, was pretty. I think that the definitions and the interpretation is still to be developed, and they probably intentionally left some of the wordings vague as the important sectors that are covered by the foreign investment law. They also cover greenfield investment, but what are the important? And they also have a big sort of a catch-all area for important critical technology to be covered by the foreign the restriction on foreign investment. So that what means to companies is what was passed usually not to be subject to China national security review was the minority, the foreign to foreign investment. So like investors investing, say, Cayman Holdco, which is a typical structure used by a lot of China giant tech companies like Tencent and Alibaba, which has a main operation in China. Those were typically, and in the past foreign investment laws were specifically excluded under the scope of review. Now with the new law come out, we haven't seen the interpretation yet, but the expectation is those investments would now be covered by the national security review, and including a greenfield investment in China.
Yeah, clearly a lot going on in that space. I want to sort of dive deeper into the specific technology areas and go from Wenting back to Michael. Michael, you painted a really good example of sort of what's going on over the last 20 years, right, for the auto industry, taking us down to Samsung, right? And your word of advice is really to look at other areas of Asia for partnership, for investment. Is that the advice that you would give to folks in the auto industry, or are there sort of exceptions to that? Are there auto companies that are succeeding, Western auto companies that are really succeeding in China now and have pretty positive outlook?
Yes, I think you're talking about Tesla. They've had a sensational run. They've been in business manufacturing cars in China for just a year, but in that first year, they blew the doors off of everyone's expectations. They sold more than 100,000 cars, more Model 3s in China than even in the United States. Their factory is producing, humming, they're adding capacity, employment's there. They're even exporting Teslas to Europe. So you couldn't ask for a better start for a US tech company in China. The question in the back of everyone's mind is, why has China been so welcoming to Tesla, offering it 100% ownership when everyone else has had to joint venture, building the factory in record time, extending loans from state banks on sweetheart terms to Tesla? Where's the give? And we have to be realistic. China doesn't give anything for nothing. So they say, oh, in compensation for this, Tesla will move its world-class supply chain into China, and China could emerge as the manufacturing hub for Tesla worldwide. So it's hard to argue with Tesla's success. It all looks very good. But again, where is this going long term? Will Tesla be able to keep its advantages, or will we see other very formidable competitors like NIO, XPeng, Li Auto come up and start taking share from Tesla? That's the question mark.
Your sense is quite unique in this case, and the sort of lessons learned from Tesla is not necessarily something we could replicate for other companies.
That's right. If you look at the Detroit 3 in contrast, they have lost about half of their sales since 2017. No specific reason why. It's sort of like, hey, they were on a roll and now they're in a reversal. Why? Why aren't they doing as well? Well, Chinese companies are getting much more competitive and they're losing shares to the Geelys, the BYDs, the Great Walls. And also, China's dominating its electric vehicle market, the biggest electric vehicle market in the world. 95% of brands, electric vehicles sold last year in China were Chinese brands. So the pendulum seems to be swinging in favor of the home team, and it makes foreign automakers a little bit uneasy about where this thing is going.
Denise, can I just interject a comment on this subject while we're on auto? Because I think it's everything that Michael's saying is fair, and I think there's a lot of room for a reason for concern on the part of international automakers and the auto industry in China. But at the same time, they are also looking at China as a source of supply. The supply chain for auto in China is critical. As many of you know, something like 70% of batteries in the world are made in China. Many of the international automakers have been scrambling to lock down their source of supply for batteries and other components in China, because if they can't, then they're going to be left in the dust globally when it comes to lots of things, including electric vehicles. So I think it's easy to say that you need to diversify out of China, but for certain things, you just can't. You're at the mercy of China. And so I think that is the tightrope that many companies are walking, is that they're looking at China as the most important auto market in the world, and also as the most important source of many auto components in the world. And EVs are going to be coming out of China. I mean, I think there was an announcement that NIO and others are going to be exporting lots of vehicles to Europe and elsewhere, if first, and maybe eventually someday to the US, who knows. But so I think there's both the market aspect and the supply chain aspect, both of which are difficult to decide, what to do on.
Maybe Howard, I'll stick with you because I see a question here in the chat for you regarding decoupling and semiconductors. And in particular, the question is, how should the US and China reconcile their national security concerns with regard to semiconductors? Because that is clearly driving decoupling. What would you recommend?
It's one of the more difficult questions out there. I think there are contradictions on both sides of the fence. I think the US wants to decouple, but they can't because they don't want to shoot their own semiconductor companies in the foot. And so I think there's going to have to be a surgical decoupling, but not across the board decoupling. The Chinese side recognizes, and you talk to any specialist in China, and they'll tell you that China is years behind the US on semiconductors. It's the area where they're way behind, if more than anything else. And so they're going to have to be relying on US for advanced semiconductors for a long time, assuming the US will give it to them. And so they're putting massive investments in semiconductors in China, but it's not going to help them catch up faster than many, many years from now. So I think the two countries still need each other in semiconductors quite a bit. I mean, it's just one example.
Can you think of any particular measures or frameworks that could be put in place to build more trust in the semiconductor supply chain?
I think the trust level is probably one of the lowest in semiconductors. So I'm not sure there's much that can be done other than negotiate certain levels of supply. And the Chinese are going to do what they're going to do with respect to investing in the sector. The US is going to look after its own interests when it comes to protecting its own companies and its revenues and business, and there's going to have to be a balance struck on both sides.
Yeah. Well, this is maybe a question for all of our panelists. Just thinking about some of the key areas where a lot of these tensions are playing out between US and China and technology is in the mobile application space, especially recently with TikTok and WeChat, Alipay. I just saw, of course, this is not mobile apps, but the Trump administration is pretty aggressively trying to sort of roll out rulemakings and formalize a lot of this stuff as a legacy before the transition takes place, right? So maybe I'd open this to anyone who's willing to answer it. But what do you think is truly driving these actions in the mobile application space? Is it truly a national security concern, or is it more about technology dominance, commercial success? Andrew.
Sorry, Denise. Could I just quickly go back to a couple of things that both Michael and
absolutely, yes,
Howard said, and then we can come back to the mobile app piece. Well, I thought Michael's comments were really well put around some of the challenges in this electric vehicle area, right? Because I think it's a very good microcosm for the question of what types of technologies can you partner in China on, and what are the ingredients that you need? Like, what is the Tesla of pick your space? Is it animal-free foods, gene editing, vehicle electrification, energy storage, health diagnostics, surgical robotics? Like, what are the ingredients of that will facilitate a Tesla-like partnership? And I think the key piece there really is around the level of technology differentiation and how far a Chinese partner perceives a US partner is ahead of the curve on. So if you talk about the Detroit Big Three, I mean, there's no there. I mean, the Chinese automakers are already ahead of that in a lot of ways. Tesla has a different package. They've come up with something that both from a brand, technology, and product standpoint is exceptional. That's not that easy to recreate. So, you know, if we take an example of battery technology, which I think Michael referenced, batteries are the enabler of the electrification revolution. And you think about some of the macro pieces there that are important. Massive government support in China around battery production and electric vehicles. There's a massive supply chain that already exists there. Production infrastructure that's already there. And then, of course, it is by far the fastest growing auto consumer base in the world. And so in the battery space, you know, what are some of the types of ingredients that I think would be necessary? It's something that is a fundamental break or a fundamental moonshot level breakthrough that captures their attention. And in some ways doesn't even seem that competitive because it is seen as being, you know, farther out there. You know, a couple of examples of that, you know, QuantumScape, which is a battery startup that has been in the press lately. I've known this company since inception through investments at my prior firms, Lightspeed Ventures, and as a general partner at Coastal Ventures. You know, they recently had a successful IPO and they're valued at over 20 billion. It's a battery company, right? They accepted a sizable investment from Shanghai Automotive, SAIC, Shangqi, which is the largest automaker in China. And part of the reason for the interest from the partner on the other side was that this was something different than anything that they had ever seen. And it wasn't something that was just lying around in another R&D department somewhere locally. That was part of the reason why they were interested. One of 1955 Capital's investments, Reconcile, they've developed a novel silicon-based platform to transform the world's lead acid batteries into higher performing batteries than lithium ion. They also accepted investment from one of the largest battery exporters in China. And why is that? It's because China has the largest supply of silicon wafers. They have half of the world's lead acid manufacturing capacity. And it was because this was the first company that this group had seen that was mixing some of these different elements into a differentiated platform that really could power this type of technology development. So I think, you know, as you think about, you know, why semiconductors is a topic, it's because there's a perception that the US is farther ahead. If you look at a lot of these other categories, I think that's sort of the, you know, the critical piece that not only attracts the attention and investment from Chinese and other overseas partners, but it's also the key to a productive partnership. Because if the technology lead is there and there is a real desire to work together, that's where the collaborators are going to stay in line. That's why they're going to have both economic and reputational incentives to stay the course. And so I think, you know, that is one of the pieces that I think is really important for us to recognize around, you know, how these types of partnerships can work. If you have a Tesla-like lead across brand, product, manufacturing, technology, there are more levers that a technologist or a company has at their disposal to create and enforce a productive partnership that is lasting.
So Andrew, I think that's an excellent point and a really great observation, but I wonder, you know, clearly China's being very strategic here about who they partner with. And so for an American firm deciding whether or not to partner, I think there are these short-term and longer-term considerations, right? Lots of short-term gain from partnership. And I think it's very clear, you know, if that they're seeking knowledge transfer, that they're seeking technology transfer to some degree. So how do you weigh those two mindsets, you know, the short-term versus the long-term, and how do you protect your longer-term interests?
I think that's a great question. And it's something that as a earlier stage technology investor, we spend a lot of time thinking about that with our companies. You know, one of the statistics that I think one of your later speakers is going to talk about is if you think about what powered the Silicon Valley revolution back in the day, a lot of historians would say it was the amount of government-led investment into fundamental R&D by the US government. it was something like 2 to 3% of overall GDP was thrown into, or the government's budget was thrown into that type of R&D. That number has dropped to about 0.5%. China today is somewhere in the 2.5 to 3% range. So if you think about a lot of the companies in the United States that are building these amazing cutting edge technologies in healthcare, environment, climate change, and automotive, whatever, they actually don't necessarily have the same resources and sources of funding that they might have 10 or 20 or even 50 years ago, right? And I think when we talk about a lot of these moonshot technologies, CEOs are often thinking about, how am I going to cross the chasm, the valley of death in funding to be able to commercialize and get the product out so that my technology sees the light of day? And I think this is a very important part around how we think about, do you partner in China or Southeast Asia or Middle East or Africa? You weigh the risks of, negative things happening with, is my technology going to see the light of day and succeed? So, with that being said, what are some of the things that potentially can help American companies brave that type of partnership level? Well, I think, again, first and foremost, you have to have a differentiated enough approach that keeps them in line, keeps partners wanting to work with you and incentivized to work with you. I think second is finding collaborators that have experience partnering globally and, again, have real strong incentives to stay the course. And sometimes that might mean you're partnering with an entity in China that is not developing the thing that you're developing, right? So they might be a different part of the supply chain or the value chain. They may be in an adjacent industry that potentially can use your technology in a way that helps them, but they're not the developers of that technology. So finding the right type of collaborators that have the right incentives that are aligned so that their first priority is not how to steal your technology. I think another piece is, as a technology developer, creating a multi-pronged approach to protecting your IP. And some of that could be around how you segment your development, engineering, and manufacturing efforts so that you can have different parts of it outside of China, other parts inside of China, certain partners working on different pieces of it, so that there's not sort of an overarching view of the entire, all the secret sauce of the entire system, but compartmentalized ways of viewing it. And a number of the companies that we've worked with over the years have seen some success in doing that. And I think the other part of it is investing in trusted teams on the ground in China that really can maintain, monitor, and strengthen the relationships. Trust is such an important element that we've talked about again and again here, and having people who are really committed to doing that on the ground and managing those types of relationships, I think become really critical. But I think to your point, Denise, there's no risk-free silver bullet here. But I think technologists need to weigh whether the elevated chances of being able to bring their products to market and impact the world are worth the risks involved. And I think in many cases, they are.
I see a lot of heads nodding from our other panelists. Do folks want to reinforce what Andrew said or offer another perspective?
We all saw just a few days ago, Apple made a big announcement, or news leaked rather. Apple did not make the announcement. News leaked that Apple was in talks with Hyundai, of all companies, to get together to build an Apple car. To me, that was highly significant because everyone's excited. Maybe someone else will give Tesla a run for the money. But more importantly, it indicated to me that Apple could have easily gone to China or to Foxconn and said, hey, you're our suppliers. It's all concentrated, biggest car market in the world. All the suppliers are there, all the materials are there. Why did they go outside of China? Why did they select a Korean partner if this comes to fruition? And it signals to me that there is a trend for companies to say, Asia's a big region. China is number one, but it's not the whole game. If we're smart, I think for many years, American companies, tech companies got intellectually lazy. China became Asia, or Asia became China. That was it. Just get into China and watch your profit and growth take off. It was easier before. That's no longer the case. It's hard to get in. It's tough competition. So look for tech companies to start planting seeds, more seeds in India, in Korea, even Japan, Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia in the 1990s was the darling of foreign investors. It was just high times there. Thailand, Indonesia, now we have Vietnam. The pendulum swung north to China for 20 years. Everyone poured their investments in there almost blindly because it made sense to do so. And I think that era is closing, and we're going to have a rebalancing across Asia. Watch that Apple story as one of the indicators of where things might be headed.
I see a question in the chat related to what you just said, Michael, and this is for anyone who wants to answer, is where else in East Asia in particular, you mentioned a couple of different regions to look out for, but where in East Asia do you see sort of a critical mass of prospective candidates for VC investment?
Vietnam is hot right now, very hot. Think of it as almost a junior China just getting ready to blossom. The workforce is highly motivated. Manufacturing is moving in there. They're starting to invest in important infrastructure. Vietnam is at the top of the list that when people come to us and say, where else in China? India, of course, has been there and will continue to be there, more in the software space than in the manufacturing space. And then you have dark horses like Indonesia, fourth largest population in the world. Boy, there's got to be opportunity there. I used to live in Indonesia for 5 years. If Chinese companies themselves are investing heavily in Indonesia and into Thailand. So that's an indicator that they see the future shifting from a highly competitive home market to, hey, where's the new growth opportunity? Looks like India, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam. That's where people's appetite is moving right now.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
I would definitely agree with Michael on that. Southeast Asia, across the different regions from the countries that Michael mentioned, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore being a even more important flashpoint for that capability than it has ever been. I think with a lot of the events in Hong Kong that have happened and sort of the U.S.-China tension, a lot of eyes have now shifted over to Singapore. Along with the regulatory and government support around embracing more technologies coming out of Singapore as an epicenter. One of the areas that has become very discussed a lot in the news lately has been food technology, right? I mentioned earlier, 300 million pigs died from African swine flu, and there's a massive protein supply shortage right now, not just in China, but with China being the traditional exporter for a lot of these things, through the entire greater Asia region. And so, like Michael said, there are 300 million people in Indonesia, many of whom eat meat. And so, thinking about that, a lot of the local VC investment, as well as the way that a lot of American companies have thought about the path through Asia, now Singapore and that part of Southeast Asia has become sort of the first port of call. When I was a general partner at Coastal Ventures, we were the Series A investors in Impossible Foods. And at 1955, we're early investors in Nature's Fine, which in 2020 raised more than $100 million from Al Gore's fund, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos' fund to commercialize new protein technology. And right now, the Singaporean government is creating more mechanisms from a regulatory standpoint to approve more of these types of alternative proteins to get to market. As well as creating a lot more sovereign wealth funding around this category as well, right? So, the region's supply shortage, fast-growing middle class, a consumer base where buying habits are less ingrained than they are in the Western markets, really create a very interesting opportunity for companies like Impossible Foods or Just or Nature's Fine, where their recent launches in Southeast Asia, and then kind of by corollary, Greater China, have been very well received. So I think that Singapore is definitely becoming a very important epicenter for a lot of this action because of the tensions with China and the political issues in Hong Kong. And that is going to create, a lot more activity for entrepreneurs and technology investors in Southeast Asia as well.
Great. Well, I think you guys have provided a lot of really interesting insights and recommendations for companies, for investors looking to go to China, to partner in China and elsewhere in the region. But, looking into the future now, just a little bit at sort of what's happening next week with the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, we're going to have a new set of leaders in Washington. And so my question to you is, do you think that a Biden administration will stay the course that the Trump administration has laid out in terms of the U.S.-China relationship on technology and decoupling? Or do you think that they might take a different approach? What would you recommend to them? And I'll let you guys decide who wants to go first.
I can probably go from just sort of more policy legal perspective. I don't expect there will be a drastic change to the current tension and just the competitive dynamics between U.S. and China. There was a lot of bipartisan support when the pharma regulation, export control regulation came out. So I think that will probably stay the trend. But at the same time, I don't expect this to be worse. I mean, right now there's zero dialogue between U.S. and China. I think with the Biden administration, I think that would change. There will be an open up dialogue with China to come up with a solution or the way to stay or the way to handle the current tension and the long-term competitive dynamics between the two nations. And in terms of the suggestions, I'd say right now in the current sort of regulatory environment, I think the certainties and clear and consistency approach and policies and regulations and how to deal with China is lacking. This is where we need, and frankly, this is where I think the U.S. should take the lead this is something they are focused on, and they should come up with a clear and consistent approach and policies and to tell their allies, hey, this is what we're doing, and you can't be a unilateral approach against China. That would hurt the companies in the U.S. because that would give them the competitive advantage. A lot of the other companies take advantage and do business with China. So you want to call your allies, hey, this needs to be a multilateral approach to sort of deal with China. So with that, U.S. should first stop the blaming games and come up with clear and consistent approach and laws and regulations, not a bunch of threats through presidential orders.
Got it.
Yeah,
Andrew, I'll turn to you because you mentioned earlier in your remarks these areas for cooperation, health, right, environment. It seems like if the U.S. wanted to sort of restart discussions with China in areas for mutual cooperation, those could be two areas. But how does the pandemic shape that, right? Potential for cooperation. Let me turn it to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's been obviously an awful year with so many different countries dealing with the pandemic in very differential ways with differing effect, but just a lot of tragedy around the world. And if I could imagine a world where countries really did embrace each other, holding hands in both the scientific side as well as the deployment side of solutions, we might be having a very different start to 2021. And so I think that if nothing else, the pandemic illustrates the importance of taking away the infighting and the fear mongering and so forth and finding global solutions to global problems. And as I said before, I think moonshot solutions can serve as an olive branch to unify nations like the US and China against common obstacles, whether it's climate change, access to healthcare, or the pandemic. So I think, kind of tying it a bit more into your earlier question, I think partnerships between nations like the US and China can help ensure that these technologies have the resources and market access to properly commercialize. I truly believe as an early stage investor that there are many scientists, researchers, and companies that end up not being able to successfully take their product anywhere because of this lack of partnership or access to government support, capital, and markets. So I think, in thinking about the Biden administration, I'm hoping that the policymakers won't fear the collaboration, because if they fear that collaboration, they will miss a lot of these technologies that have gone through decades of development and really need that collaboration to succeed. I think technologies that were developed by companies like QuantumScape or Nature's Find require such large efforts to bring them to market that having the ability to get support both from the US government as well as just kind of the world stage level of government becomes important. So my hope is a couple of things. They continue to protect the interests of American technologists. They substantially increase the amount of investment into fundamental research, development, and commercialization. These two things will help American companies be more self-reliant, but also give the innovators more leverage with which to negotiate these types of cross-border partnerships. But I'd also strongly encourage the administration to be more open to creating a set of policies, guardrails, and red lines jointly with Chinese leadership to maximize the chances for productive collaborations, for the trusting long-term relationships and these high impact outcomes in areas where technology contributes to the global good, and in most cases to the good of the Chinese people and the Southeast Asian people. Climate change, public health issues like COVID, food supply shortages. So it's my hope that with what's coming next week, that policymakers are lowering the barriers to cross-border collaboration, and they're enabling innovators to find these trusted partners in regions like China and Southeast Asia that are desperate for the inventions. It won't be without risk, but the rewards could truly benefit the world, and that's my hope for this next phase here.
Great recommendations. Michael, Howard, I'm going to give you guys the final word here because I think we're coming up against our time limit. What are some words of wisdom or advice that you have to the Biden administration? Or how would you recommend that we try to build additional leverage with China, right? I mean, Michael, you were the one who said earlier that, China has a massive market. That's why we want to enter China. China wants our technology, particularly where we have more advanced technology. But at some point, you can imagine Chinese companies want to go global as well. They might want to access the US market. Are there ways to leverage that dynamic to our advantage to accomplish some of the goals that Andrew and Wen-Ting mentioned?
Yeah, Denise, I agree 100% with your words. It's ultimately, if we're in private talks with the Biden administration, it would be leverage. The Chinese are very good at understanding their own leverage and applying it. So their biggest market in the world, hands down, is so many markets. And it's worked. It's drawn billions and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment on the promise of getting access to this market. What's our leverage? And how do we maximize that leverage vis-a-vis China? Let's just take the gloves off a little. Let's be realistic. What is our leverage? Is it access to the US market? Is it access to US technology? Then let's use that and not dance around it. The other thing I would ask or recommend or seek as a citizen of the United States is, one of the toughest things about operating in China is the ambiguity. There's the place is rife with ambiguity when it comes to what are the rights and responsibilities of me as a foreign company operating. What are my guarantees? What am I guaranteed once I get on the ground? And how do I know that won't change tomorrow? Because laws and regulations and the application of those are fickle, are unpredictable. So is there something the administration can do to get a word of guarantee from the Chinese side that you're in good hands, American company, if you're operating in China? You don't have to worry about something dramatic happening tomorrow.
Excellent points. Howard, you get the last word.
Okay. So I would make one other observation, which is that as Wen-Ting pointed out, there's been absolutely almost no dialogue happening between the governments in the last couple of years at the departmental level, the agency level. I mean, government to government, just no communications practically at all. Similarly, even because of COVID, I think information flows between the two countries in terms of media, in terms of private discussions and the travel bans have gone to virtually zero. So the fact that I was in China recently is a bit of an anomaly. I mean, it wasn't easy to get to China. There's not a lot of people from China wanting to come to the United States these days. And so I think the information flows at the official level and at the private level, the citizen level, have gone to near zero. That's not good for the future. I mean, if we're going to coexist as two countries, we need to at least be talking to each other. And so I think there needs to be ways to promote that. And certainly I'm very focused on the private side of things too, because I mean, the people to people communications, whether it's visas or it's travel or it's private organizations communicating, that's been a foundation of the relationship between the two countries. And that has really gone away as well. So I fear that that's something that needs to be revived.
Excellent. Well, I think after 4 years, the relationship really could not be worse than it is at this point. So it's only upward and onward from here. I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of risk, but truly a lot of opportunity for future cooperation. So with that, let me thank our panelists. You all were terrific. I learned so much from you all. I hope our audience did as well. Let me turn it over to Margaret to wrap things up.
Thank you, Denise, and to all of our session 4 speakers. Asia Society has 13 centers around the globe, and here in Northern California, we're going to be doing lots more on tech, so stay tuned.